We're very, very lucky this morning to have Wayne Townsend as our guest speaker. He, as you know, is the curator of the Dufferin County Museum and Archives, and everyone in Dufferin County owes Wayne a great deal of appreciation. He's made that Dufferin County Museum not only into an excellent county museum, but it's now a destination for people from all over Ontario to come as tourists, to come as researchers, to come as history buffs. And it's a real treat to go up to that museum and see the wonderful displays that they have from time to time, from week to week, from month to month. And that takes a great deal of effort. So we were very, very fortunate to have Wayne, a local boy, educated in the Dufferin County system of education, to be with us tonight. This is the first of, as I say, three presentations, and Wayne is starting us off with this. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to introduce him, but I'm going to ask Wayne now to make his presentation. Let's welcome Wayne.
Well, a few ground rules here first. If you don't want to hear my speech, the history's on here, just take this sheet and leave. It's quite fine with me. I think you did a good job, because when I was preparing this, I had a really hard time figuring out the Zion 1 and the Bethel 2, and I'm not sure I got it right, and frankly, they're all dead, so who cares? But it's down here, right? You can do it. Second ground rule is, typically we're talking about Presbyterian traditions. Traditionally, that's a 2.5-hour presentation, which I have prepared for you. Does this sheet sound more appealing? All right, I can move that around. All right. The third thing is, I really enjoyed the hymns. I thought that was really a nice touch, because one of my complaints about modern churches is you go to them now and you don't know the hymns and you can't sing along, but I'm not sure about the Buchan Church, to be really honest with you. It's a real opportunity for me to be here. It's a real honor, because not only do I really respect the people in the churches of Dufferin County, but this is my neighborhood, and that makes it especially important. The Tweedsmuir Church has always been so much a part of my life since I've moved to York Street, and you've sent us some absolutely wonderful ministers as well. I remember Mr. Chang and Mr. and Mrs. Self could not be better neighbors in any neighborhood. We're so proud to have them here. Now that she's a famous author, maybe we'll get the name of the street changed or something like that. The Presbyterian is very generally in this, I guess, the history of the Presbyterian Church, I'm not really going to get into it that much, because the Presbyterian Church, as you know, has gone through all sorts of changes, just like the United Church and any other churches, joined and amalgamated and changed and stuff like that. So if I do get a little bit mixed up, whether it's the Canadian Presbyterian Church or the regular synod, I'm not sure, but I want you to know that your church has always been a church of people. And that's what's kind of interesting about the Presbyterian Church. It's all about the common person. It's a church which seems to attract interesting people as well. So my purpose today, what I was told to do, was to bring you from the beginning of the church to 1925 to church union. What I hope to do is do a little bit of that, but to drag into you some real characters. And I'm glad you mentioned Bess Marshall, because I leaned really heavily on her book. I don't know if you've ever read A House in the Kingdom. Who's read it? Well, then you can leave. And the other is a wonderful play that was written called A Kirk in the Town, I believe, and I think Bill Bothwell wrote that. Do anybody remember that one? And it is a real great source of information. A little far from the truth in places, but I think that's sort of Mr. Bothwell's style, and it's really, really a good little resource. I'm going to start way back, sort of the first records I can find. It's a little dry, but it does pick up a little bit near the end of this 2.5-hour speech. The first record I can really find about the Presbyterian Church in this area, and I can't really restrict it to just Orangeville, simply because in parts we've been connected with Aaron, we've been connected with Mulmer, we've been connected with Mono, just anybody who will take us, sort of, we join into. And of course, Dufferin wasn't invented or even thought of till 1881. I went back, we've got a wonderful book at the museum, which I bought at a used bookstore a number of years ago, and it was published in 1868, and it's the Historical and Statistical Report of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Do you have this book in your little library? It's a really great resource. And I'm just going to read, it's a little dry, but it's kind of interesting. This is, try to remember that this was written in 1866 about the Presbyterian churches in this area. They talk about Caledon and Mono, first of all. In the townships bearing these names are 3 congregations, respectively 16, 11, and 8 miles apart, which were united into the charge under Mr. William Hamilton. The minister arrived in 1831, stayed till 1839. He was Reverend Alexander Lewis. And many of his descendants, Mrs. Harkey's, and who was another really well, the Campbell family, of course, Doc Campbell, and them were direct descendants of Mr. Lewis. When he got here, there was absolutely no building, no church, and to be quite honest with you, quite a heathen crowd. Dufferin was a little rough. It was predominantly Irish. The nice Scotch hadn't sort of penetrated into this area. And the first thing that was here was liquor stores and hotels, and the town was pretty wild. But he was ordained a minister in Nova Scotia. He came here and decided that he was going to come up here and preach to this group of people, and he had quite a task ahead of him. He retired in 1865, and actually he was 74 years of age, so Harvey, you've got a few years to work yet, and he had preached for 48 years. But he stayed here. He stayed here. He loved it so much he did not go back home, back to Toronto. He didn't run. He wanted to stay near his famous stone church in Caledon and the old log church in Mono East, and then a brand new one in Mono West. They had 100 acres of land of the glebe, but the writer says it was awfully poor land, even for a good Christian, and there was absolutely no manse. So he just had to provide his own house. In Orangeville in 1866, they say that it had a population of 1,500 and is surrounded by tolerably good country. There's a stone church, Bethel by name, built in 1859. There was a manse with 1 acre of land in the village because, of course, the minister had to grow all his own vegetables and food because he wasn't making very much money. The congregation was organized by the same Mr. Lewis. In Erin, which at one time was part of this charge, it was settled chiefly by Highland Scotch, and that made a good congregation. The land is hilly, but of good quality. The congregation was also organized, Mr. Lewis, and it became a union church. There's no church property, so that whole congregation down there just worshiped in houses. They never, for a number of years after that, were able to get a church building together. And then up in Mulmer. They're talking about Mulmer and Tossaronto. They were part of this area as well at one time. And I'm glad they kept Mulmer because it's kind of pretty, but it's interesting how they describe it up there. The townships lie north of Erin and are pleasant in appearance, and they are new, rough, and hilly district. The valleys are rich, but the general aspect of the country, while confessedly romantic, is not predisposed to an agricultural point of view. In other words, it was really poopy farmland. It formed Mr. Lewis's diocese. Did I get it right? Finally, I've been practicing that in the mirror. From 1837 to 1858. He as well retired to the community, the Mr. Calhoun, who was sent up there into the real wilds of the country, and they were all Irish up there. But he as well fell in love with his congregation and stayed there and retired there and is buried there. So it's very, very odd that we see this sort of affection that the ministers had for their areas. They had 100 acres of land set aside for the church to grow food, but they described the manse in 1866 as totally uninhabitable. So I'm not sure what he got stuck with. In 1837, when this church was talked about being built, many people in town, it was a very mixed town. Many of the people here were of Germanic descent, Orange Lawrence, the Van Wicks who had the hotels. There was also several different varieties of Methodists, and the Methodists of that time were very outrageous, almost Pentecostal in nature. They were hallelujah people, we like to call them. And there was tons of those in town, but mostly it was hotels. So when they decided to build this church, they thought they were going to be really modern, and a conversation started about the organ. And you know the stories about the Presbyterians and their organs. And I quote directly from the kirk to the town on this one, and it's Van Wyck talking, and he's one of the people from Holland. He goes, "If we ever do build a church, will there be an organ in it, like the ones in Holland? A pipe organ you want? John Knox called it the devil's keist of whistles. A keist of whistles, aye, a chest of whistles, a devil's closet of whistles. It makes heathen sounds. All you need to sing the palms is a good pair of lungs. And it's probably true. And the organ issue, as I start to read some of your church records, went on for many, many years. I'm glad you fixed that. Because one thing about having this church in our neighborhood is everybody in the neighborhood comes down when you have choir practice. Anybody from the choir here? For years, we come down and your windows are open, especially in the summertime. Sweet Adeline's used to practice here. There's always free music. If they talk about the Jazz Festival being free music, you guys have it every week. All we do is sit around on your lawn outside. if the other people clean up their doggy messes. We won't go into that one. Under the United Synod of Upper Canada, Alexander Lewis was sent out here. He asked to be sent out here in 1837, and that tells a lot about this congregation as well, that the ministers usually were sent out here kicking and screaming. They would try to rise in the ranks, as in any church at the time, and have more administrative jobs. But this guy wanted to come out here. He wanted to preach to the heathen. He wanted to baptize the children. He wanted to marry the people who were living out here. He was pretty used to the Scottish, but the Irish gave him a little bit of trouble. He wasn't quite used to them because they were a very, very fighting lot. And quite often in front of the church, the old, one of the churches downtown, the second Bethel, which is basically underneath the parking lot at Town Hall. When they restored Town Hall, we actually found the old foundation. I don't know if any of you went down there for that. We have photographed it and measured and stuff, and then we buried it back in again. It's under the parking lot, so we left it totally undisturbed. But the minister, Mr. Lewis, made a very, very interesting comment about the Irish and the community up here in 1837. He said he could tell why down in Toronto they were having a rebellion. The church characters in your congregation are very, very interesting as you go through it, because women have always played a very active role in this church, which again is very historically uncommon. Women were very strong. Widows weren't necessarily looked at in the Presbyterian congregations as pathetic old widows. They were seen, they were just put to work almost immediately. They were supposed to look after the church and start cleaning and painting, and it sounds like how many people are painting and how many of you are women? Let's think about this. So very, very early you started to see the women creak in, and people like Mrs. Dodds and Mrs. Lewis were very, very active in all sorts of church work, but also in beginning the temperance movement in town. And the temperance movement goes all through the sort of establishment of not only this church, but pretty well all the churches except the Catholic Church in town. They were really aware that the 11 taverns and 7 liquor stores in town were keeping people out of the churches. There was lots of talk back then about building a new church, and they built the first one in 1837. By 1841, 4 years later, they were already talking about building a new one because the congregation had gotten that big. So there was a real zeal about having organized religions, and you sort of wonder why, but in actual fact it's because people started to miss home. It was familiar. Everybody who certainly came here, whether they're Irish or Scottish or wherever, had a church background. It was very, very different out here in the wild. So when the churches started appearing and the congregations started appearing, they reminded you of home. The second thing it did was it brought people together. And I think that's what church does. It makes friends, and it makes good neighbors. And one of the more fun things that I found out about the early Presbyterian churches, after one of their churches, they had the women of the church had a seed exchange. So they got together and they really tried quite hard to make a social unit, to get together and to, because people even in Orangeville live pretty far apart. They didn't pay the ministers too much. I guess things haven't changed that much, I don't know, but Alexander Lewis had a really hard time living on his stipend, and it's very odd because he developed the churches in Erin, he developed the churches down in Mono, but he also, at the same time, kept the first post office in Mono Mills, and then he would teach at Sunday school, come back, reopen the store, get it going. He also had a delivery business, and he also had a really crafty business of lending money. I don't know if you know that about the founder of your church. He lended money carefully on very good security at 12%. So he was a shrewd banker, and I also found out through Bess Marshall's research that he deducted his interest out of the face of the loan. So there was a Christian charity in there a little bit, I guess, but at 12%, I think you could probably afford to be just a little bit generous. Although he was a money loaner and very well liked in the community, he never lived in a big house. He always lived a very, very plain existence and always was a gentleman. Any story we can read about him, and even in the one picture that exists, he's in a silk shirt, which is very, very fancy for the wilds of Mono. The second building happened somewhere between 1840 and 1846, and it was built somewhere, as I said, north of the municipal building. And we only recently found out through Bess Marshall's research, and I consider that recent, it was the 1970s, that it was stone. And it was the same stone as in Greystones, and it was the same stone as in that little cottage on Wellington Street that sits so close to the road. And although that was Mara, the shoemaker's shop, it's believed that the minister actually lived in that building at one time. And you can imagine raising 12 kids in a one-room stone cottage. Ministers obviously didn't have television. The church, it was kind of interesting for me because it seems through the years that the Presbyterians will just take on anybody if they're willing to lend a helping hand. And I kind of like that about your church, because one of the big people who built your church was a John Corbett. And as I did research on him, I found that although he'd gone to his great reward by the time the church was finally built, he was born and raised in a practicing Anglican. But he built the church. And we're going to go back to some other religions a little bit on that. So he never changed to Presbyterianism, but he continued to support, his family continued to support this congregation even after his death. It was dear famous Orange Lawrence, although he was strongly Methodist. He first was involved with the church over on the corner of Church and Wellington Street, and then, of course, this building across the road with the turret, which was added not when it was a church, but when it was a residence to prove that the family had money. They put the turret on the front, but that was the second church. And although he was very, very involved with developing the Methodist Church, he was also a shrewd politician, and he liked to hedge his bets, so he gave the land for the Presbyterians to build their church. There was 84 people on the list, and for a small town, that was really a lot of people. The Bethel 2, after the other one burnt, was built where the post office is right now, the one we talk about. And that was really interesting because they claim that it had a seating capacity for 300 people. And quite often, I understand, it was filled up. And when I think of the village population back then was somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 people, and there was all sorts of crazy religions going on, but you had room for 300 people. It turns out I know why. It's because they also were the place, it was also the church where the community could get together. So although it was a Presbyterian church, it served very, very much as a community center for all sorts of things when you had to get a lot of people together. Maybe they were just looking for the rent, or maybe they were good citizens. We cannot tell. The next minister who sort of came along is kind of interesting. I won't go too long. Though that clock's broken, I can go on as long as I want. Somebody give me one of these, for heaven's sake. It's really only supposed to be about 20 minutes. The next minister that came along to here to do your church was absolutely appalled with what he found in the neighborhood. He expressing my deepest regret and giving signs of repentance for the sin of drunkenness. And after this is one of their... when he came, I guess I didn't do the backstory. When he came here, this is an elder he's talking about. He found this wonderful elder in the Presbyterian church, and he was the town drunk. So what he did was he decided he was going to save him. So on expressing deep regret and giving signs of repentance for the sins of drunkenness, and after due admonitions, the session resolved to hereby remove the sentence of suspension and restore him to his full stature as an elder and member of the church. So obviously this is a church of forgiveness as well. It lasted about a year. Mr. McKay was very, very interesting. He became sort of the first minister who came here and started understanding that you needed to raise money to keep a church going. And he knew that congregations weren't always going to give money in the plate, so he was really, really good. He was one of the ministers that, several ministers in this area and across Canada, what they did is they took the felt out of the bottoms of their collection plates, or they would replace the wooden collection plates with metal ones so you could hear when people were throwing in coins as opposed to paper money. And I thought that was probably a really good idea and maybe something you might want to pick up. I'm not exactly sure. Checks don't make a sound. Mr. McKay started having religious lectures, so they would have things like this. And what he started doing, he started charging admission. And there's quite a lot of write-ups in the paper about that, about this Presbyterian minister having the nerve to charge admission. But it actually really, really worked really well, and the church lectures were always full. With some of the money in 1866, he really went wild, and he bought a melodeon. And he introduced the melodeon to the church, so the music began to creep into the Presbyterian church. And we understand that music has been a tradition in this church for ever since. I'm going through the names of lists there, and you think about funny names, talk about Lord Dufferin's strange name. One of your elders was Mip Harshaw. M-I-P, and in the census he's actually Mip. I don't know if there's any Harshaws left in this area. If there is, I'd love to know if Mip really, why his father might have called him that name. The Presbyterian Church, the Zion II, and it never was called Zion II, but everybody now calls it Zion II, in 1862. And when they opened up, they encouraged the Sunday schools from the two Presbyterian churches to meet together. So church union and the mixing of the churches has always been a great subject. But again, Mr. Mackay was very, very forward thinking. He thought, well, you can't get the adults to change their mind. What we're going to do is we're going to get the kids meeting together. So the Sunday schools met together, and they had picnics, and it's when the church picnics started in this church, and a lot of congregations in the Orangeville area followed up with that. But every month in the summertime, they would take the kids of this congregation to exotic places like Mona Mills, Shelburne. They went to the village of Alton, and to the Rocks, all the way down to the Rocks. Who's ever been down to the Rocks, down the railway tracks? Yeah, it's beautiful. You ever have not had that opportunity, go down the railway tracks and trespass. You go down about a quarter of a mile. There's a gate that's been kicked down by kids because they found this spot. And the beautiful old quarry is down there, and the Devil's Chair, which is where the chief of the native tribe around here used to sit and look across the Credit River and where it started. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And just don't go on a Friday night because it's really full of teenagers. The congregation, meeting the Sunday schools, meeting together really, really worked out. And in February 1867, I found a newspaper article. And guess how many kids came to Sunday school on a single Sunday morning? In 1867, 350. And we talk about, and they were so excited about this, and it was going so well, they knew they had to have even better music. So what they did is they couldn't get the right music together happening within this church, so they got the choir to come down from the Wesleyan Methodist Church and do the music for the Presbyterian services. Again, talk about learning how to cooperate. In a diary I found of 1880, it was a guy named Samuel James Brown, and Steve's probably a descendant somehow of these people, but we have the Simpson ladies left their diaries to us, and in it I found a reference to the Presbyterian Church, and the spelling and the language tells us a lot about the language of the time. Many people in Orangeville spoke Gaelic. It was not uncommon to hear Gaelic spoken on the street. The Gaelic was spoken here in Dufferin County till about 1958. They were still meeting, the Gaelic Speaking Club was still meeting together down near Marsville and below because there was a lot of people coming up from Erin to these things. So Gaelic was quite common, and quite common to be heard here in your churches as well. And I've forgotten most of it, but all I remember because she was Presbyterian Gaelic temperance, and it said, "If ye cannot walk straight on yonder path, kindly stay oot, O-O-T." And they did. And probably for good reason. So he says, I went to Orangeville with the wagon. May and Mrs. McLean went along with me. I mailed $1,000 county rate, then went to a meeting that day of 2 Presbyterian churches to form a union, UNIAN. The meeting, METING, worked harmoniously. I think that the union will be completed. Bethel and Zion may join together. And it did. He was predicting it really, really well. Then Camilla Presbyterian Church sort of joined in with this church as well for a very brief period of time. Their sponsors was the people of Orangeville Congregation and the people from Mona West. So there was also, it was very odd that they would have a church in that area because it actually forced the closing of other 2 smaller churches. It forced the closing of Mona West Presbyterian and the Mona Center Presbyterian Church, which was actually at Gooseville. Does anybody know where Gooseville is? All right, we do have a local audience. When you go towards Mona Center, you go around the first bend, that is Gooseville. Granny Newton, who's a very, very famous lady in this town because it was probably her who was the matriarch. It wasn't Orange Lawrence. They should have put a statue of her up there as far as I'm concerned. I argued and lost on that one. And she described your Presbyterian Congregation Church as the lordiest place of them all, and the lordiest palace of them all. And that's how they describe this stone church, this Presbyterian church. And I don't think it was that much of a palace, but you must remember she lived in a 1-room log house where right now the Lord Dufferin Center is, and she raised no less than 13 grandchildren in there. In 1878, we're moving along. I only have to get to 1925. If any of you are sleeping, we're almost halfway there. The cornerstone was laid for Zion Presbyterian Church. And the sort of interesting thing about this church is the Presbyterians got this really interesting idea, and it was like pre-selling. So they developed a committee, and you went out and they would canvass for the building committee. So they were actually gathering the money together before it was ever built, and their idea was they weren't going to build the church until they had enough money to do it, and did it. And what a wonderful idea that was. And it took them many, many years, but they would go out door to door, and they would actually canvass, but they were tough. They were really, really tough. George Reed promised them $200, and this was Bess Marshall's grandfather, to the building fund. He died before the money changed hands. They waited a couple of weeks, the Darling Presbyterians, and then the building committee or the canvassing committee went, and they pressured the family for the $200, and the $200 was paid. Don't mess with the church. The man who built the church, again, was really, really interesting. And when you look at a church, you just don't look at the congregations and the ministry. You try to look at the people who are helping. And it was Hugh Haley who decided that he was going to be the contractor, and he built such other buildings as the municipal building, the Dufferin County building over there. He had a hand in building the municipal building down here. And he was, they describe him as colorful, but I think he was a little more than colorful. He lived in a little house at the corner of Church and Mill Street, and it was on the banks of the river, and he would fish in there, and kids were always down in that area. The pond in Casey Gardens, where the bridge is, that used to be the bathing area as well for the town. So he sort of kept his eye on the bathing area because the rule in town was if you were over 16, you couldn't go down there to bathe until after dark. And I guess some people were abusing that and going down a little bit early. His location in the official records was called Sunnybrook. And if any of you don't know where Sunnybrook is the wonderful name that Little York used to have when it was considered the place to live in Orangeville. Hugh was born in Montreal. He was Irish, and his father had the distinction of fighting as a British soldier under Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo. When he was 14 years old, he came to Orangeville and learned the building trade. He had left home about a year before that, worked in York, but he decided the future was up here in the colonies, and he knew he could come up here and make a fortune. He didn't make a fortune, lived a very colorful life, but it turns out he gave most of his work to the churches. He would build, and although he would press for the money a little bit later, on occasion when he needed it a little bit for some liquor, I'm understanding, he wouldn't pressure the churches to pay him. And quite often, well, I know that the county never paid him for most of the bill that they owed him over there at the county building, but I'm not supposed to tell you that one. The new church, when it was built, they had some really, really special requirements for it. And churches are also the bricks and the mortar. It's not just the people. And when you talk about the bricks and the mortar, Mr. Hewitt made sure by contract that the people who made the mortar for the church for plastering used the proper proportions. It had to be well mixed, incorporated together with pure water from Springbrook. And that's the little river down here. Apparently that was going to make it even better. I guess it was special water. The sand had to be clean, and sharp lime to be the best quality of fresh burnt stone lime, and it came from the lime kilns down in the rocks. And the hair had to be long cow hair, free from dirt, and well beaten before it was used in the mortar for this church. So that's the church down there on Broadway. So they were even specific about the type of hair. Horse hair was pretty good, but long cow hair was the best, and it was known to last the longest. So if they get feisty up there at the church, just remind them that they've got cow hairs in their walls. The problem with the new church up there was the echo. The Presbyterians liked to be heard, I guess. And when they built the church up on Broadway, which is now Westminster, there was a horrible acoustics in it. The minister could not be heard, and the singing was being broken up, I'm told. You're still united, aren't you? You're going to be carrying these stories back, and I'm going to be in a lot of trouble with that church. But anyway, they complained about this echo, and how they had to cure it was they took a system, this is the 1880s, and they had to take a system of high wires, and they hung these high wires and made almost like cobwebs up in the ceilings there, and it apparently was really, really good with the acoustics. It did help a little bit, but it played havoc when the birds got into the church, because church doors traditionally back then, you must remember, were never closed during service. Doors were always opened wide. The birds would get in, they'd get in the United Church and fly around up there and get caught up in the wires. And in fact, it didn't really remedy it for that long. The problem continued for many, many years. The controversy again in the Presbyterian church and the new church up on Broadway was the spire. Some people thought the spire was way too pretentious. And the act of God kind of interfered in the argument for you, because the building was built in 1879. In May, a windstorm came along and blew the spire right off. They managed to get something back up by June of 1879 for their official opening, but it's a much shorter version than the one that was originally there and never really got to be on the actual church for very long. When you opened up the church up on Broadway, now we're really working with numbers now. They did it on a Monday evening festival, and guess how many people showed up? 3,000. 3,000 people showed up. 3,000 people, and they put $170 from collection away. Bethel, I guess they must put the cloth back in. Bethel decided that this church up on Broadway was, Bethel 2, decided that it was so perfect that they actually closed the old stone kirk and they cast in their lot with New Zion. So the church amalgamated back again. The government, the old church, we're talking about Old Bethel, was the one here where the post office is, and the local people decided that was going to be the best place for the post office. The federal government was supposed to decide where the post office went. They wanted it somewhere else, but the local people had nothing to do with it. They came to the people of this congregation, bought the property illegally before the post office agreed to it, and that's where they said the post office was going to be. Does anybody remember what the problem might have been with that? The cemetery. The cemetery was so full of Presbyterians by then that you could not hardly see the church. They were back to back and on top of each other. They figure somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,000 bodies were in there. And right next door was the waterworks. Think about it. So they decided they were going to put the post office there, and the town actually began to move the bodies. And we're not sure how successful they were. Every time when they do tear up over there, I kind of go over there and expect to find a leg bone or something. Haven't found it yet, but I have found some of the smashed china from the dishes from the original church over there when they were digging up behind from the last renovation. So they had to move all those bodies. They had to get rid of the stones. It was quite a process, and one that took several years. They said, and this is what a person said in the newspaper about it, said the post office, if it is built on the graveyard, would be built upon ground where not even a pauper could erect a dwelling house. The building may rise in stateliness and grandeur, but this will only more surely and more intensely remind the people that the ground on which it stands was purchased by means of a vote secured by the basest dishonesty and fraud. The Presbyterians didn't mind, though, because they got $300 for the lot. And that was at 3 times what they got, getting 3,000 people there. So they knew what they were going to do. By 1886, I was shocked to see that you had 265 families as members. That's huge, again, for the population of the time, because by the 1880s, people had started moving out of Orangeville and moving into the wilds of Melanchthon and Luther and Amaranth and started to go where there was cheap land again. That's a lot of people. The local representative back then were the Hunters, because the Hunters started out Presbyterian and then flipped over to the United Church much later. And Keith made a comment ahead of this. He doesn't know why he left the church. This may be why. They were wise people. In 1888, Mr. Hunter, which would be your great-grandfather, represented Orangeville, the new St. Andrew's Church, and he went down to Toronto morning, and he went and he hung his Persian lambskin coat on an inner wall. Taking advantage of absence of the home mission meeting, the coat disappeared. It was next seen in the hands of a thief who was endeavoring to pawn it in a junk shop on Queen Street West. Before the bargain was effected, however, he became suddenly alarmed and fled the shop without the coat or money. The coat was handed over to the police, and in the afternoon, the Reverend Mr. Hunter secured his property at the police headquarters and was prepared to journey north to the land of the snows, adequately covered. So maybe it was the loss of the coat. I'm not sure. I don't know. I know where it should be. It should be at the museum. The next minister after that was Mr. Hossack, and none of you will remember him, but he was extremely outspoken, and he had a very bad habit of writing his opinion into the local newspaper, which was interesting because it was very religious in bias, and of course it was a Catholic newspaper, so they had great pleasure publishing all the comments that he had. Most of his comments had to deal with the way the Presbyterians were raising money, because he said in very forcible terms that dealing with the building of choir and congregational singing, he didn't believe that the building should be as pretentious as it was. He didn't believe the choir should be wearing robes, that set them apart and made them angelic. He didn't believe in congregational singing because it distracted from the sermon. And he really felt that they should not be making money by garden parties and tea meetings. He thought that was a disgusting way to raise money. However, in 1889, he had to change his tune a little bit and raise money any way they could, because in the end, $1,300 was missing from the church coffers that year. They found out who the culprit was, and being good Presbyterians, they went and they asked him about it, and he paid it. The culprit paid it back at $50 per month. It was paid back eventually, and the garden parties continued because it found out that was a sure way of making sure your money was there. How did you get to stop being a Presbyterian? I tried to look at some of those records because, there was no way. I found this wonderful little reference in a newspaper, and they went, Mrs. James Daniels, Miss Annie McKittrick, Mrs. Robert Perfect, Mrs. Lewis Watson, Mrs. Rachel Watson were removed from the rolls of the Presbyterian Church by reason of death. Oh, dear. Mr. Dickey came next, and of course he was a really controversial minister, because in 1897 he did something that no Presbyterian minister in this town had ever dared to do before. And this is what he did. The reverend gentleman discards the pulpit and stands at the side before the people and delivers his sermon with a great deal of oratorical effect. He came from behind the pulpit and stood with the people. And that was a very big move for a minister at that time, because they were always supposed to be better and separate. Not only was he controversial and spoke from there, but he also was a skilled hockey player. And he brought all sorts of glamour to the game, and he organized a football team for the Presbyterian congregation. So if you ever want some fun, you can have a football team. In 1901, I looked at your financial records, and I was very distressed to see, or wondering what your congregation was like when I see that. They had plate collections, that was $74. They had envelopes, $254. Schemes, $46.15. Makes you kind of wonder what in the world you Presbyterians were up to. But there was a lot of money going out by then, because Donald Fraser, well, he got $5.80 for pumping the organ. He would sit underneath it and pump it, and he got paid for that. So there's a lot of expenses going on that one. In 1904, again, the church had a great controversy. The congregations got together and decided what they wanted to do on this issue, and they voted that they were going to move to individual communion cups. And again, that was in that period in 1904, that was a very gutsy move. And on December 4th, 1904 was when the St. Andrew's Presbyterian congregation used them for the first time. It was the ladies who paid for them, and it was the ladies who had to clean up after them. And it was the money from not just the ladies, but it was the Spincers convention of the Presbyterian ladies. So don't be Presbyterian girls or you'll never get married. In 1904, again, I found a record of a controversy in the church, because during the evening service, the fuse blew in the new electricity, and the audience was silent and in darkness. So all of a sudden, again, the people who didn't think it was right to electrify the church said, well, this is God's way. He's stepped in. He's taken away our electricity. We should rip it out. They didn't. The next minister, Reverend Birch, was an incredible temperance man. He caused all sorts of controversy in this town because, again, wide open liquor laws here. The legal selling of liquor was rampant, and he felt that it kept people from church. Another lady in the paper wrote a little bit later, it didn't keep them from church. She said she sees them brawling on the streets on Saturday night, but on Sunday morning they're sitting in front of the pulpit. And again, I think that the Catholic newspaper was more than pleased to put that type of news in. 1906, again, the controversy about the choir came up because they, again, wanted to take off those darn gowns. They really did. In 1908, being a very inventive congregation, you didn't have enough parking for all the horses and buggies around. And rather than spend the money, because Presbyterians tend to be a little tight with their cash by reputation, they couldn't decide what to do. So rather than buy that, they made agreement with all the local hotels that they were supposed to be fighting against to rent their parking lots for the horses on Sundays, because they weren't supposed to be open and the lots were empty. It kind of sounds like Clover Farm to me, because I remember when I was a kid, you'd come to town for the United Church here and you'd end up parking at Clover Farm on a Sunday because everything else was full. I don't think Mrs. Leader charged, though. The largest crowd that ever you Presbyterians put together was actually for a funeral, and it was up at St. Andrew's Church, and it was when Harry Maguire was killed, and he was the first serviceman in the First World War to lose his life in Orangeville, and we have a wonderful portrait of him at the museum that was painted by a well-known Canadian artist. 1,200 people filled the sanctuary and wings, and 250 more were turned away. That's 2,500 people from this little community came to that funeral. That was how the people felt about the war. And the Presbyterian ladies, I am told, managed to take their lunch and serve all. So that's quite a thing to do. One of the more interesting characters, and I'm only about 5 more minutes if you're falling asleep, I promise, it was Thomas Temple. And he was a caretaker. And it isn't just the ministers and the elders and stuff. The caretaker was a very, very important person, because we had wood stoves back then, so they had to get the wood in and take the ashes out, and probably didn't have a painting committee. They probably made him do all the painting himself. But also, as well as his duties as a caretaker, it was his job on every Sunday to take the pulpit Bible to the vestry or minister's study for safekeeping after the service. He would bring it out on Sunday morning, and I'm told he would stand there beside the caretaker, would put a little robe on. He would stand there with his head bowed and wait for the Bible, because it was his job to look after it. In 1902, he was honored with a 4-generation party because he had held the caretaker position for over 23 years. So the church actually threw him a party. Who looks after the place now? They're going to throw you a party, I promise. It's tradition. It's a year of anniversary, so you're getting a great big party. He looked after the church until he was 88 years old. Out of the 29 years, he missed only 15 Sundays. And there was only one Sunday, October 29th, 1908, where no fire was lit. He was admonished by the minister, and he said they didn't need it. It wasn't cold enough. He was not wasting the wood. Talk about taking care of it. In 1920, it's interesting, in a spirit of getting along, that your organist here was Mr. Hannison. And Mr. Hannison was any of you remember stories of the Hannisons? The Hannisons were a wonderful family. They were a Negro family. They lived up on Purple Hill, and they were the family of Seneca Ketchum's daughter. She had 7 kids. They're all listed as African. There was never a husband. They were buried up on the hill. Hannison Cemetery is still up there. When they built the subdivision up there, Mr. Lennox and I tried to convince them where it was. They didn't believe us, and they found them anyway. And the family did not agree to have them moved, and that's probably one of the more interesting. This has nothing to do with the Presbyterian Church, but probably the most interesting day of my career, because I got to find the descendants of the family, and not only tell them that they just dug all their ancestors up with a backhoe, but to let them know that they were all African. And the Hannisons at that time had no idea that their background was African. So anyway, Mr. Hannison was, of course, being of the Ketchum family. They were the Anglicans supreme, but the Hannisons themselves flipped over to the Presbyterian Church. One of them became a very well-known Presbyterian minister, and the other, AC, was the organist here, and he had a children's choir. He started the first children's choir. And when he first started up, it was 55 kids would sing, and their first song was Fairest Lord Jesus. And the children's choir became so popular that they would go to all the other churches in the spirit of cooperation. Again, if you had a special service in the United Church or the Catholic Church or whatever was the Baptist Church, used them a lot as well, they would hire Mr. Hannison's children's choir from this church to go over and provide the entertainment. The Sunday school has had a great influence over the years, and when I get stuff at the museum, one of the things I'm always surprised with is how many people got diplomas and gifts and things like that, or books for memory work. How many of you remember having to learn the Beatitudes? And I remember that. Do you still do that in Sunday school? Yeah. It's so interesting for me because when we get the papers, they're usually whittled down to that which is really, really precious, marriage certificates and bonds for gold companies that never went anywhere. And there's always a little frame for certificate, and there's always one if the family is Presbyterian. The Presbyterians were the worst for making the kids sit there all through the week. You wouldn't do it just after Sunday school. You'd have 2 or 3 meetings during the week as well, where you'd be brought in, the minister or the elders would teach you, and you'd get your little certificate. And I remember you would get bars if you got them. You'd get a little bar and it would dangle, and you knew you were a good Christian because you bent over, your little bars would be dangling like that. But we were united. We only had to remember it once, then we could forget it, and it was okay. We still got our bar. In 1924, they started talking in earnest about church union, and that's as far as I'm going to take it, but I'll tell you a little bit about the church union here, just as a preamble to your next speech. It was a very, very sad time for Orangeville because church union blew this town apart. I mean, you could have gotten away with murder at that time and it wouldn't have made the paper. The paper's just filled with those who believed in it, those who didn't. The Presbyterian Church was a little different because they'd already gone through all sorts of different changes and amalgamations and breaking away a little bit from the Church of Scotland. So they were a little more liberal in their thoughts about it, but not enough to obviously separate all the congregations. The old controversies came up. The people from the Bethel churches tended to vote for union, and they stayed at St. Andrew's, and the people who came from the other congregation, they broke apart, and that's what the basis of this congregation is. Basically, they did not union. So when you look at the vote really, really carefully, from a more historical perspective, you'll see if you check the names that the two churches kind of split apart again. So you think you changed and you think that everything worked out, but old feelings died hard, obviously. The church union not only dealt with the controversy of how they wanted to deal with their governance and things like that, but it dealt with all sorts of crazy things like music. And when the Presbyterian church decided to break away here, there was a huge fight of who was going to get Mr. Hannison. Obviously, because he was such a fabulous organist, they wanted him up at the new United Church, but he stayed here. And he would practice. He would make a practice, I am told, I can't prove this, that when church union talks were going on, he would open up the windows of the church, not this church obviously, but open up the windows of the church, and he would practice for hours every night as loud as he could, proving that the Presbyterian music, he wanted to be heard all across Orangeville. And it must have been a long and loud and late, because in the newspapers there's actually editors a letter complaining about the noise coming from the Presbyterian church. So that's one way of dealing with church union. Some of the churches joined, some of the churches didn't. The votes are very, very interesting, as I say. Corbiton remained Presbyterian. Camilla stayed Presbyterian. Shelburne stayed Presbyterian. They kept a church. Waldemer kept a Presbyterian congregation going. There was a lot of them who didn't basically join up, and that was probably good. What wasn't good, and this is what you won't hear, I'm sure, in your next speech, and what we will follow up sometime if you want, is the bitter court battle that followed afterwards. The Presbyterian church was in court for a number of years afterwards about who owned the church property, who was going to be paid, what the people up there that joined the United Church, what their compensation for the building was going to be. The congregation that decided to stay Presbyterian, I don't know if they'll tell you this in the next or not, is the last. I'm going to tell you about the spirit of cooperation, because the congregation, after they lost the church up there, before they built this one, met in the Gem Theater. And the Gem Theater was owned by Mr. Merlina. And Mr. Merlina was a Catholic. And not only did he give you Presbyterians free rent, he also paid for the hydro and the heat. So it shows you a little bit about the spirit of cooperation that your congregation has had. By that time, it was pretty well known as Campbell's Church, because the Campbells were very opinionated. And Doc Campbell, I remember even as a kid, they would still call this Campbell's Church. It never officially was, but I think Mr. Campbell liked to give the impression that he ran the church here, and he was a very interesting character. When you finally got after the Gem Theater closed down and the new one was built, the congregation then met in the school, in the high school. And I was just talking to a beautiful young lady over there who was telling about her high school was actually in the, where did you go to school? On the furniture store, yeah. Yeah. That's, to me, it's unbelievable. So there you've got the Presbyterians meeting in the school's meeting on top of Dalton Patterson's. It was very hot up there, probably getting used to you Presbyterians what it would feel like when you went to hell. And I'm sure that there's absolutely no air up there, was there? No. But you got through that. You went to the theater, then you went to the school. No matter what, you wanted to have a church, and eventually you did build the church, and it became part of recycled corners, as I like to call it. When I'm doing my little school tours along the street, I always call this recycled corners, because the Legion across the road, what's it? Who's old in this place? Come on. It's the high school. That was one of the portables from the high school. When it burned down, they brought up here and made the Legion. And the house on the corner over there by the United Church is a completely recycled house. They tore it down in 1927 and recycled it, all the bricks and stuff, and rebuilt it, and won the 1927 Canadian Home Design Award. Now it's some office building or something like that, but recycled building. And then Tweedsmuir Presbyterian Church, of course, because where did you get your stones? I heard the right answer. Yeah, the stones came from the cement plant. Portland Cement was being torn down, and being very frugal in nature, the Presbyterians wanted to make sure that they got some cheap building material, so they bought the stone down there. The secret is they didn't have quite enough stone. There was a little bit of extra stone bought, and it came from a stone hotel that was being torn down. But we won't go into that. So the church is history. The church is people. It's the ministers, it's the caretakers, it's the elders, it's the Sunday school, the choir. You all are part of history. It's really important to realize as you're celebrating your 175th anniversary that it's your anniversary. It's the anniversary of your congregation, but it's the anniversary of you and what you do within this church. And for many of you, as I look across there, a lot of your families have been involved in this church for a long time as well. I want you, as you travel through the next 175 years, to keep the traditions. Keep the windows open on your church when you're singing, because I still like to walk by and hear music coming out of those windows. Still be good neighbors. One thing I like about your church is your lack of parking. So it forces people to park up on our street, and it's so neat for me on a Sunday morning to go out and see people I know and get to say hello. And it's important that you understand that you are a very, very important part of this community. When I talk about people, when I'm trying to direct them around Orangeville and stuff like that, I always say, turn where the stone church is. And every bus driver from every tour company across Ontario happens to know. They don't know where John Street is. They don't know where the old fire hall used to be, but they know this old stone church. It's not as old as it looks, but they remember it. It sticks out in their memory. It has a solid foundation. Look forward to the next 175 years, because I know some people out there are going to make history. There's going to be somebody in 175 years talking about you, Mrs. Perry. Or definitely they'll be talking about Jim Wilson and his antics at church. I can guarantee you that. We will become part of history, and that's what makes a congregation alive, because it includes us, it welcomes us, and it makes us take our Presbyterian religion or our God out into the community and to make a lasting effect, because that's how you live Christianity. It's not what happened inside here. And you Presbyterians were the worst. You lived a good life, a frugal life, and you were always there taking part in the community, whether they were the Catholics or the Baptists or whatever. You would take on anybody and not be segregated away from the community. So keep up the good work. Thanks for being such a good neighbor, and I really enjoyed speaking here. Not much of an ending, but it's so nice to talk to people you know. There's something familiar about this church, and thank you very much.